everyone has written their questions down. Dr. P. Kleinman went first. If you still have a question for him to generate, please slide that in. We'll put it in here. Tony Buda went second. And if you're just getting those written down, that's great. We'll get them up here on the podium in a second. I will go through some of the questions. And first, we'll start with Dr. Kleinman. Let's see. All right, so you showed a slide that showed the pH solubility of different manures compared to fertilizer in your different pH sources, and the solubility was much greater for the fertilizer P than for the range of manure pH sources, with dairy being the lowest and poultry litter and swine than fertilizer. The question is, does this remain the same over time after all these sources are incorporated into the soil? Okay. Real close to your mouth.
That wasn't the question I was expecting the way you let it do it, but this is an easy one. No, I mean, the best thing you can do is stick the soluble source in the soil and then it's buffered by the soil system. So that first slide that I showed with the phosphorus sorption isotherm, most of that phosphorus that you're putting in there is going to get bound up. And that's a big reason from a management standpoint why we want to see it down in the soil. I thought you were going to ask about the kind of differential response of fertilizers, so mineral fertilizers, which are for all intents and purposes, 100% water soluble, and manures. And I can get into it, but it very much has to do with the characteristics of the manure. The manures actually hold that soluble phosphorus up above the soil for a period of time, whereas with a mineral fertilizer, when you broadcast it, it tends to dissolve immediately and then translocate. It goes in with the infiltrating water and gets bound that way. That's the reason that relationship that I showed is not linear. It plateaus with the fertilizer. That makes sense.
All right, thank you. Another question is, what can be done to update or produce newer and more reliable soil test recommendations for today's crops and varieties?
Okay, there needs to be it needs to be just, I think, a massive campaign. Reached out to the fertilizer industry already, including to the Moroccans, OCP. IP&I needs to be involved. That's the group that's extremely effective at bringing together the academic community and the distributors and the soil testing community. We need to put the sexy back into soil fertility, so there have to be new trials that convince folks that the recommendations that we're generating are applicable to today's varieties. But we also need to take the data that are already out there and combine them. So we have a massive source of data that's sitting in filing cabinets, that's sitting in some retired soil fertility expert's box that he filled up on his last day at the job. And those need to be pooled and then attacked in the same systematic, transparent fashion that I alluded to with that Australian initiative. That was an IP&I-led initiative. It was brilliant. It reflects the societal investment in most of this research, and we have to have it out in front of folks so that these aren't recommendations that are all kind of obfuscated by people who talk like me.
All right, great, thanks. I hope we'll get moving down that road. Looks like we're going to jump back into the cover cup question again. Not really surprised. You showed the data about the dissolved P in your freeze-thawed rye versus bare soil treatment. Can you offer any ideas about possible immobilization of those released nutrients after they come out of that plant material? And do microbial populations control the fate of those nutrients released from that lysed plant material?
Well, since with the freeze thaw, a lot of that's happening during fairly cold times of the year. I don't think there's a lot of microbial activity that you can assign to it. So mobilization, I don't think is, for that particular set of examples, a dominant process. I've got to emphasize that we do our science in different ways. I showed you one study that was a watershed study, so that for you folks is probably real world. For us, we go back and we reduce that entire world down to things like little boxes of soil, little columns of soils, and they really kind of amplify those effects. So I showed a combination of that. I showed you first a slide that was based upon using packed soil boxes and soil columns And you saw there under controlled setting the potential to release the phosphorus and the control of basically the vegetation on the concentration of dissolved phosphorus that we were observing. But then the watershed setting, I think, is the one that should be more compelling to folks. And that is that there are very real changes that are happening. Now, that's opportunism. It wasn't totally controlled. You have to take a little time. It's consistent with other observations around the world. And the reason I put that out there is, and I started my talk with this, and that is that we get caught up in overselling things. And it doesn't matter if you're looking at it from an environmental perspective, if you're looking from an agricultural perspective. We have to be real that none of our systems are perfectly optimized. We have not figured out, and we never will. There's always going to be that unintended consequence. And so when we go out there with our conservation programs, which we have to go out there, it's deplorable how little conservation we have now compared to even a few years ago. And so you hear that from some of the great conservationists and visionaries who are working with it. But we also have to be cognizant of these trade-offs, and those trade-offs exist. And so if you're in Lake Erie and you're concerned about dissolved phosphorus transfer to the lake in very small loads going there, you have to start to recognize those trade-offs and tackle them. That maybe the tool that we thought was great because it's such a wonderful soil conservation tool. It has all other kinds of benefits too vis-a-vis soil health. But for dissolved phosphorus, you're not going to capture that as part of your strategy. And if you're starting down the path of creating, those are hypotheses. So I get very frustrated with colleagues who I should be working very closely with when the first thing they want to do is talk about the improvement in the ecological community that's associated with the adoption of no-till and with cover crops. And so we're going to have these systems that internally cycle nutrients and can do no harm. That's actually in a Lake Erie report, if you can imagine that. There is no room in reasonable science for that type of hyperbole. And so I'm getting a little work, I get passionate about it because it's my thing. But I think we've got to be real clear that there are trade-offs, and as we go, and there are trade-offs everywhere. So if you're sitting there as an environmentalist and thinking you've got the phosphorus problem linked because all we're going to do is ship the whole thing out of there, well, you've got another thing coming because you're going to hear from Doug Smith a little bit later about legacy phosphorus. So we have to be very realistic about our managed systems and the fact that one decision is going to beget consequences that we're not really looking at right now.
All right, and there's 3 more questions about cover crops. And I'm going to weave them together into one. All right? So in Maryland, the primary purpose for planting cover crops is to trap soil nitrogen that's present at higher than desired levels in the fall after a summer crop corn harvest. Is the benefit of doing that, of planting cover crops, cereal rye cover crop or cereal grain cover crops for that purpose, is the unintended consequence of the potential for dissolved phosphorus leaching out of the destroyed tissues in the spring, does that negate the benefit of using those cover crops for the fall nitrate trapping? And if so, should we only target our cover crop application on only those very high nitrate soils in the fall?
So I guess I was going to get kind of snippy about that because it seemed like a leading.
Go ahead, get snippy.
I don't think it negates it. I mean, in fact, I think the way that's phrased is kind of ridiculous. That these things, we're not managing just phosphorus. I was talking just about, no, it wasn't you, Frank. There were other things you said that were inappropriate about that. We're managing both of them. And if you live only with looking at the world through the lens of the Chesapeake Bay, you think sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus are everything. So we're managing sediment too. But that's not what the folks who are out there managing the landscapes are worried about. That's part of what they're worried about. And so I think that I'm just going to answer this generally because I think we have models of these out there. I won't say that they're necessarily that good, but they try to tackle this. That's what, as much as people want to criticize the Chesapeake Bay model, I can take parts of it down. It tries to go through exactly that calculus, which is, as we look at these things as systems, what are the trade-offs that are there? So you have this tremendous benefit. I just was talking about phosphorus and soil conservation earlier, but you have with the catch crop then a nitrogen conservation benefit. And so let's be real about that. But as we move through there, let's not over-credit it. And so if the concern is with phosphorus right now, let's be aware of the consequences of what we're doing out there. And we tend to overcredit because we advocate our programs. That's all. It's a simple message.
All right, Pete, and one more to wrap up your soapbox standing. Back to pea sources. If you take manure and you compost it, what's that do to the available pea and the dynamics of pea when it's after it's land applied?
I was writing down the question, but okay. So we had, I'm just going to use an anecdote. So we had a student who, we were working with a wonderful farmer, a guy named Ross Orner, who's been on the Pennsylvania Conservation Commission, runs a dairy up near what they call DuBois, Pennsylvania, Dubois. He is really a leader. He was featured in Chesapeake Bay Journal in terms of some of his voluntary activities that he does. And so very concerned about what he was doing in generating manure. And so he composts his manure, then he takes that and he vermicomposts it, and he sells a little vermicompost, but mostly he just does it because it's the right thing, and then he spreads it. So you have a number of trade-offs that are associated with this process. The first, of course, are economic. He does this, I think, in large part because he thinks it's the right thing to do it. It's not because he's really making any money out of it. But what we saw with phosphorus solubility, again, real risky because I'm just talking about one thing here, is that phosphorus solubility actually did go down as we went through the composting process, probably because of the mobilization, and then into the vermicomposting process. But when we tried to translate that into an environmental risk, it got goofy pretty quickly because you're not putting these materials out there at the same rate. I can set up a study where I do that, but no one's going to do that. You have all these other variables that are, including cost. It's expensive by the time you go out there and buy a little bag of vermicompost to put out. So you're not putting them out there at the same rate. And so it's a difficult comparison to make. It's a very difficult because our systems are not based right now on the composted. But we did see some changes in the pea solubility. So if it's just pea solubility alone, you can manipulate that. You can do a lot more than just composting. I mean, there are all kinds of amendments that you hear from some of the folks that are here in the audience that can leave that phosphorus more or less available to the crop, but reduce its solubility so that it's less apt to run off and run off. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think it's time to pass it on to Tony.
I think you hit it in there somewhere. All right, thanks. All right, Tony, you're up. Grab that microphone very close, please. I'm going to start with a question that's going to lead to, I think the first one's a joke, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to deliver it in a light-hearted message. Is it your fault that increasing ditch density or ditch depth moves more phosphorus, or is it just the physics of the system? And I'll tie that with,
is it my fault?
Is it your fault? Yeah. To tie that with the question about on ditch drain systems, how can ditches be managed to reduce pea movement, and do vegetative buffers help?
Well, so the first one was just if you're just increasing the intensity of drainage.
If you increase the intensity of drainage or the depth of the ditch, you move more pea. Is that just physics, or is that?
Yeah, that's you're kind of hydrology of the system essentially. If you're connecting,
closer to you.
Oh, sorry. You're just connecting, more pea sources to either ditches or tiles by intensifying. Then you're kind of up against it with the nature. By creating discharge points for that groundwater to move, then yes, you're increasing the risk of phosphorus loss by intensifying the drainage. But the second part was on what can you do in terms from a management perspective.
Right.
There's a whole host of ways to potentially try to disconnect the source from the receiving water. They range from two-stage ditches, for example, that are really popular in the Midwest region, where you create kind of a trapezoidal channel and a floodplain, and then another, so you're kind of allowing for some of that water and the suspended sediment and phosphorus that's moving in ditch water to deposit on the floodplains. There are just different ditch practices, either clean outs or things that I think that you can do. A lot of work that we've done has kind of focused on the filtration end of things, and so recognizing that you're getting pee delivery to a ditch, you can either put filters in ditches, and so these filters can have phosphorus sorbing materials. A popular one that we've been experimenting with quite a bit is gypsum, FGD, gypsum, flue gas desulfurization gypsum. It's from power plants. It's a byproduct of coal-fired power plant production. And you can put the gypsum either in a filter in the ditch, or a colleague of mine, Ray Bryant, has experimented not only with these ditch filters, and Josh McGrath has also done some of this work. You can put what are called curtains, so basically permeable reactive barriers. You dig a trench adjacent to the ditch, and you can put gypsum in these curtains, and there's a potential for the gypsum to sorb pee or to precipitate it out. They can work under certain conditions. The filters are great in ditches for small storms, but in larger storms, they kind of get overwhelmed. The idea of the curtains is really to kind of get at that slower moving groundwater, where you have more time for the water to react, in the curtain or in the permeable reactive barrier. And we've been kind of experimenting with those for several years and seen, yes, that they can reduce peat concentrations, shallow groundwater, but there's still some question of how their efficacy over the long term.
Okay. Another question about P saturation and P runoff from low P areas. There's a low P source, but you have a lot of transport potential, a lot of water flowing through it. What can be done about those situations where you have a low P saturation, whether it be a managed field or a native or woodland area, and you have a lot of water running through it? What can be done to reduce the overall P delivery from those areas?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of the riparian buffers are there's opportunities to look for uptake or to some extent those are areas that are just going to contribute. And that's not to say that there's nothing that you can do, but riparian buffers are probably one opportunity to get any kind of uptake, or different kinds of cropping patterns, I guess, where you can phytomine the phosphorus that's there and just reduce the source. On the hydrology end of things, it's kind of difficult to control the amount of runoff that's being generated from those zones.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk today about focusing on two different areas which are flat and artificially drained. One being the northern Ohio Lake Erie area, and the other being the coastal plain of the Delmarva Peninsula. The question is, what are the differences in legacy P in those two systems?
Differences in legacy P between
the Lake Erie system and the Delmarva system.
I'm not as familiar with the Lake Erie system. I might actually, I don't know, Pete, you want to address that? I can only really speak to the Maryland system.
We're going to hear actually from probably the legacy P expert on that a little later on, Doug Smith. But the problem in Lake Erie is primarily driven by crop production and fertilizer management, whereas what I kind of simplified our issues to be is this overarching issue of manure management. The manure management really is a tough nut to crack, and so the manure management here, if you look at some of the, and that's, I just put things on the screen that you can find in various publications. But we have some very, very high areas of soil phosphorus concentration, and they're higher than the soils that we see around Lake Erie. And so I think there's a magnitudinal or amplitudinal, whatever the word is, difference in terms of the size of that source. But there are many, many similarities as well, because some of the areas are highly connected. That should be the message that you got from Tony Buda. That is that connectivity that can make even a very small source an important one. So we really want to think about here and trying to tackle that, or disconnecting as much as possible.
Okay, and Tony, back to you on I think 2 softballs here to close us out. Maybe not. Can you talk about the relationship between soil organic matter and runoff? And if you lose an organic matter in the soil, are you increasing runoff potential?
Soil, organic matter, and runoff.
Yeah.
I don't know if, the relationship between organic matter and runoff, but I imagine, there's a better potential to, kind of soak up water and.
Let me do this. He's a watershed hydrologist. He's not a soil scientist.
Yeah.
So
let Pete take it
from his, and I'll tell you the reason why. There's a lot of disciplinary bias that comes with these types of conclusions. But of course, from the soil science standpoint, you try to improve the infiltration properties of the soil, and one of the best ways to do it is to get organic matter in there, and you get associated plum-like structure, and so that concept really revolves around what Tony was calling earlier infiltration excess runoff generation. This was the dominant Darcy
Hortonian.
Robert sorry, I got my guys mixed up. I play hydrologist, but I'm not one. And so that is that the infiltration properties of the soil dictate whether or not you're going to have runoff in combination with the storm. You've got a big old storm and it dumps on there and it overwhelms those infiltration properties. What Tony, throughout his career, has focused on is the landscape role in runoff generation. So saturation excess runoff. And that's what he demonstrated earlier. And that's where, and this is very important distinction to make. So in our rolling landscapes here where you have various features that perch water tables, when those soils become waterlogged, like what he showed over there, you can sneeze and almost generate runoff. It doesn't matter how much organic matter that you have in that particular soil, because the landscape process of water moving downslope and accumulating in these spots overwhelms that management potential. You might be able to kind of tinker around the edges, but it's not as important. And those are the areas that we've been going after as critical source areas. This is one of these distinctions that needs to be drawn out. So if you're in a well-drained landscape and you're interested in managing runoff, go for the organic matter improvement. I mean, that is definitely going to improve your infiltration and reduce infiltration excess runoff. But if you're in a landscape where the dominant mechanism of surface runoff is saturation excess, then that same concept does not apply.
All right, and Tony, last one. You ended up your talk talking about the effects of some singular large storm events. What categorizes a large storm, and when do you have to get worried about the impact of a single storm, or is it just a continuum from drizzle to hurricanes?
No, we usually use frequency distribution, and often the return period is kind of the how we define something that occurs, say, once per year. Fairly regular, the kind of storms that you're used to getting on an annual basis versus a 10-year or a 25-year or one that returns maybe once every 100. And these are basically just probabilities. What's the probability of getting an event in excess of some amount? And so. For stream flow records, we have anywhere from 50 to 100 years, and we could look at these records and see what's the probability of getting a peak flow of some amount. And so, hydrologists use these tools, these statistical tools to define, what, is an extreme event based on either the amount of flooding that occurs or the size of the flow. You can also do it in rainfall, look at, the amount of rainfall, the intensity of rainfall, and it's, the ability of a storm to exceed a certain amount, a certain intensity or a certain amount. And so that's kind of the approach that we take in looking at what's the frequency that the storm returns, how often do we see it, and what's the impact it has on either nutrient loss or flooding or whatever it is, whatever our concern is. And so Bill Gaburick and Andrew have tied the flood frequency in some of our smaller watersheds to the risk of phosphorus loss by using that information and combining it with the ability just to define a contributing area, and how does that contributing area get larger with larger and larger storms. And so, we can do this, whether we should probably be taking this into account more and more, as these extreme events become more common, in nutrient management.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. Before we move, all right, say thank you to these two speakers.